Last year on this channel, I did a video series about the biblical family tree, which primarily focused on the characters from the Hebrew Bible, a book that is used by both Jews and Christians. Well, today I'm going to show you the family tree of Islamic prophets, specifically the 25 prophets that are mentioned by name in the Quran. You'll notice that many of the names on the Islamic tree are pretty much the same as the names on the biblical tree. However, there are a few subtle differences, so as we go through, I'll be pointing these out. In my video about Jesus, I made it clear that I myself am not a Christian, and I therefore approached the topic from a purely academic perspective. Well, since this video is about the Quran, I feel that I should also mention that I myself am not a Muslim, and that therefore, once again, I'll be approaching the topic as an academic, not as a follower of the religion. If you want to get a copy of either this poster or the poster about the biblical family tree, you can head over to our website, usefulcharts.com. So the first thing you'll notice about the Islamic version of the family tree is that it does not include any images of the various people on it. Most people are familiar with the fact that Muslims consider it offensive to draw or make any lifelike depiction of the Prophet Muhammad. Well, generally speaking, this rule applies to all of the Islamic prophets, not just to Muhammad. So that's why I've chosen to use icons made out of calligraphy instead. And by the way, the artwork was done by my good friend Siawish from the Islamic history channel Al Muqaddimah. So shout out to him for his great work. Like the biblical family tree, the Islamic version starts with Adam and Eve, the first man and first woman, although in Islam, Eve is usually called Hawa. Another major difference that I should point out is the fact that the 25 individuals highlighted on the Islamic chart are all considered to be prophets, whereas on the biblical chart, the word prophet is only used for certain individuals, such as Moses or Elijah. So for example, in Islam, Adam is seen as being a prophet, whereas in Judaism and Christianity, he is not. According to one Islamic tradition, Adam and Hawa had two sets of twins, a boy named Qabil, who had a twin sister named Iklimia, and a boy named Habil, who had a twin sister named Layuda. Those familiar with the Bible will recognize the two boys as being Cain and Abel. Anyhow, Adam arranged for Qabil to marry Habil's twin sister, and Habil to marry Qabil's twin sister. But as the story goes, Qabil got angry because he felt that his own twin sister was more attractive, and therefore he wanted to marry her instead. This, along with other reasons, eventually led to Qabil killing his younger brother Habil. Thus, the line continues through a third brother, known as Shaith or Seth. Now, in my video about the Bible's version of this tree, a lot of people asked, if Adam and Eve were the first humans, who did Seth marry? Well, according to the various Abrahamic traditions, Adam and Eve had many other children beyond those listed by name, and therefore Seth would presumably have married one of his sisters. But at this point, I should remind you that according to my own opinion, and the opinion of most professional historians today, when it comes to these very early stories, we are actually dealing with mythology, not real history, so we shouldn't interpret the details as being literal anyway. However, I also want to point out that viewing Adam and Eve as non-historical does not automatically make a person an atheist. I'm actually Jewish, and although I view most of the Bible as being myth and legend, I still find it to be a pretty important book. I know that many other Jews, as well as many Christians and Muslims, hold similar positions. But since this video is simply about the family tree, as traditionally understood by Islam, I won't go into the various scientific and theological debates. For now, let's just continue looking at the tree. The next major prophet in Islam is Idris, and he's generally seen as being the equivalent of the biblical Enoch. In fact, all of the names from Shaith to Idris, as well as beyond, pretty much match up with the names given in the Hebrew Bible. The spelling, which is based on Arabic, is just a little bit different. According to Islamic tradition, Idris was the first human to use a pen and the first to pursue astronomy and other sciences. He was also the great-grandfather of Nuh, better known in the West as Noah. You'll notice that I made Nuh's box a little bigger, as well as several of the other later boxes, such as Ibrahim's and Musa's. This is because these prophets are known as the Ulul Azmi, or arch-prophets. Ulul Azmi literally means the unwavering ones, and out of the 25, only 5 are given this special designation. Nuh, of course, is best known as being the man who built the ark and who thus survived the Great Flood, along with a few other humans and a bunch of animals. One main difference between the Bible's version and the Quran's version is that in the Quran, Nuh had 4 sons instead of just 3, and that his 4th son drowned in the flood, as well as Nuh's wife, in both cases because they did not believe Noah's message. The next 2 prophets, Hud and Salih, are not characters found in the Hebrew Bible. Hud might correspond to a briefly mentioned descendant of Noah named Eber, but Salih is not mentioned at all. However, in the Quran, there's a story about a tribe in Arabia called the Thamud, who demanded Salih give them a sign from Allah. Now, note that in Arabic, Allah simply means God. It's not a proper name or anything, so I'll be using the 2 terms Allah and God interchangeably. So anyway, in response to the demand, God made a female camel miraculously appear out of a stone and provide them with milk every second day. But eventually the people injured the camel, and for this, their city was destroyed in an earthquake. We now come to the second of the 5 arch-prophets, Ibrahim, better known to Christians and Jews as Abraham. At this point, there's a very important split in the tree, as well as several major differences between the Quranic version of events and the biblical version of events. According to both traditions, Ibrahim had 2 main sons, Ismail and Ishaq, also known as Ishmael and Isaac. Ismail is the ancestor of the Arab people, and therefore of the Prophet Muhammad, whereas Ishaq is the ancestor of Banu Israel, meaning the house of Israel. Islamic tradition has many tales about Ibrahim that are not found in the Bible. For example, there is much more information about Ibrahim's life in Mesopotamia before he traveled to the land of Canaan. One famous story has him being thrown into a large fire for promoting monotheism, and in that story he walks out unharmed. But the most important difference between the Islamic version of Ibrahim's life and the biblical version concerns the sacrifice of his son. In the Bible, Ibrahim is commanded to sacrifice his second-born son, Ishaq, whereas in the Quran, although the name of the son is not given, the person in the sacrifice is generally understood to have been Ibrahim's firstborn son, Ismail. In Islam, both Ismail and Ishaq are considered to have been prophets, as well as Ibrahim's nephew Lut. Lut is the equivalent of the biblical Lot. And in Islam, the story of God destroying the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah pretty much mirrors the biblical story. However, Islamic tradition has a lot more detail about Ismail. According to Muslims, Ibrahim took Ismail to Mecca, where together they built the Kaaba, which today is the most sacred site in Islam. When Muslims pray, they always pray in the direction of the Kaaba, and one of the pillars of Islam is the requirement to make a pilgrimage to the Kaaba at least once in a person's life, if they are able. There's a famous story that occurred just after the Kaaba was built. When Ibrahim was about to leave Ismail with his mother Hagar in Mecca, Hagar asked, "Who will take care of us?" To which Ibrahim replied, "Allah will." After they are left alone, they eventually run out of water, and Hagar runs between two nearby hills, Safa and Marwa, 7 times, searching for water. When she returns to Ismail empty-handed, a miraculous spring suddenly appears, which is now known as the Zamzam well. Today, the pilgrimage to Mecca often includes traveling between the two hills 7 times, like Hagar did, and then a drink from the well. All of the remaining prophets come from the line of Ishaq, with the exception of Shuaib and Muhammad. After Ishaq came his son Yaqub, who is Jacob, and Yusuf, who is Joseph. In the Quran, most of the prophets are mentioned, often in passing here and there throughout the book, as opposed to in just one place. However, Yusuf is unique in that his story is told, well, as a story. The chapter of the Quran that deals with Yusuf is one of the most detailed narratives in the whole book. Generally, the story follows that of the biblical account, with a few extra details. Basically, Yaqub had 12 sons, out of which Yusuf was his favorite. His other brothers were jealous and ended up throwing him in a well, where he ends up being sold as a slave to Egypt, to a man named Al-Aziz, who in the Bible is known as Potiphar. Years later, Al-Aziz's wife becomes infatuated with Yusuf. In Christian tradition, the name of Potiphar's wife is not given, but in Islamic tradition, it is Zuleika. Because of Zuleika, Yusuf is eventually put in prison, where he ends up becoming known as a person who can interpret dreams. To make a long story short, he ends up correctly interpreting the dreams of the pharaoh, for which he is then made vizier, or prime minister, of the entire country. The next 2 prophets do not come from the line of Yaqub. In Islam, Ayub, who is known as Job in the Bible, is thought to have been a descendant of Yaqub's brother Al-Alyas, aka Esau, whereas Shuaib is thought to have been a descendant of another son of Ibrahim, known as Madian. Interestingly, although Islam originated in Arabia, only 4 of the 25 prophets named in the Quran lived there. Shuaib is one of those 4, the others being Hud and Salih, who I mentioned earlier, and of course, Muhammad. I should also mention that although only 25 prophets are mentioned in the Quran, it is traditionally understood that there were about 124,000 prophets. So perhaps there were more in Arabia that were simply not mentioned. Anyhow, most scholars believe that Shuaib is the person who is called Jethro in the Hebrew Bible. He was a priest in the land of Midian, which is located next to the Sinai Peninsula, and it was his daughter Sephora, in Hebrew Zipporah, who became the wife of the next major prophet of Islam, Musa. Musa, better known in the English-speaking world as Moses, was the 3rd of the 5 Ulul Azmi, or arch-prophets. And in fact, his name is mentioned in the Quran more than any other prophet, showing up a total of 135 times. Musa and his brother Harun, known in English as Aaron, are primarily associated with the Exodus story. I won't go through that story in this video because most people are already familiar with it. And also, I'll be doing an entire episode on Moses next week. But I will mention that Musa is the first of 4 prophets to be associated with the giving of a holy book. Obviously, the Quran is the most holy book in Islam. However, there are 3 other books that Muslims consider to be holy, and all 3 of these are mentioned by name in the Quran itself. The first is the Tawrat, better known as the Torah, which was supposedly written down by Musa. Because of his association with the Torah, Musa, or Moses, is of course one of the most important prophets in Judaism, and is in fact generally considered to be the founder of the Jewish religion. Like I said, I'll be doing an entire episode on Moses next week, particularly looking at his potential existence from a historical perspective. So I won't say much about him now. Next, we come to the most mysterious of the 25 prophets, Dhu Kifl. In fact, some Muslim scholars do not consider this person to have been a prophet at all. He is only mentioned in the Quran twice, and there is no agreement on which Bible character, if any, he might correspond with. The leading theory is that he is the same person as the biblical prophet Ezekiel, but again, this is debated. The only thing we really know about him is that he preached in Babylon, and that his name means owner of the double. Next on the list are the only 2 individuals who, at the same time as being prophets, also held the title of king, Dawood and Suleiman. In English, David and Solomon. This father and son pair descend from a son of Yaqub named Yahuda, or Judah, whereas Musa and Harun come from a son named Lawi, or Levi. Like Musa, Dawood is associated with a specific holy book, in this case a book called the Zabur. Generally speaking, the Zabur is thought to correspond to the book of the Bible known as the Psalms. I'll also point out that Suleiman is a name that has been used by many Islamic monarchs over the centuries, most notably by the greatest of the Ottoman sultans, Suleiman the Magnificent. Next up comes the prophet Ilyas and his successor Ilyasa, both of whom are thought in Islamic tradition to be descendants of Harun, and who correspond to the biblical Elijah and Elisha. Like in the Bible, in Islam, Ilyas is said to have prophesied during the reign of an Israelite king named Ahab. If you watched my series on biblical genealogy, you'll know that Ahab is important in that he is one of the earliest characters in the Bible, and thus in Islamic tradition as well, for which we have indisputable evidence for in the archaeological record. In Islam, Ilyas is often associated with a figure called Khidr. Although he is not mentioned by name in the Quran, Khidr appears in the accounts of several prophets, most notably Ilyas. Who exactly Khidr was or is up for debate. Some see him as kind of an angel, whereas others see him as more of a saint. I should also mention that although Ilyas, or Elijah, isn't considered to be one of the arch-prophets in Islam, he is generally considered to be one of the 2 most important prophets in Judaism, the other being Moses. Okay, another prophet mentioned in the Quran is Yunus, who corresponds to the biblical Jonah, who was the prophet who got swallowed by a giant fish. We then come to Zachariah, Yahya, and Isa, all characters who appear in the Christian New Testament, not in the Hebrew Bible, which Christians call the Old Testament. Zachariah was a priest and was the father of Yahya, who in the New Testament is known as John the Baptist. According to the Quran, Zachariah's wife had a sister who was married to an elderly man named Imran. Imran was the father of Maryam, but then after Imran's death, Maryam came under the guardianship of her uncle Zachariah. Maryam is, of course, the woman better known to Christians as Mary. However, Maryam is also a very important figure in Islam. In fact, some Muslims, albeit a small minority, see Maryam herself as a prophet. Of course, even more well-known than Maryam is her son Isa, known to Christians as Jesus. In both Christianity and Islam, Mary is said to have given birth to Jesus as a virgin. However, according to Christians, Jesus did have a father, and that father was God. But according to Islam, Isa simply did not have a father. So for Muslims, Isa is not the Son of God. He is, however, considered to be the Messiah and one of the 5 arch-prophets. He is said to have received the 3rd of the 4 holy books of Islam, a book called Injil. Injil means gospel, and Muslims believe that there was once an original gospel revealed to Isa, but now lost, upon which the 4 surviving New Testament gospels were based. The final thing to note about Isa is that many Muslims, like many Christians, believe in some sort of second coming or return of Jesus, which will occur at the end of history. Okay, we now come to the most important prophet in Islam, the 5th of the 5 Ulul Azmi, the prophet Muhammad. According to Islam, Muhammad was the final prophet and is hence known as the Khatam an-Nabiyyin, which means the seal of the prophets. In other words, after Muhammad, Allah's direct communication with his human servants ended and was sealed off. According to Islam, Allah revealed to Muhammad the final and most important book of all, the Quran. But for Muslims, the Quran is not just a book. It's the literal word of God, and not a single part of it can be changed or even adequately translated into another language. It differs from the Bible in that, whereas the Bible is usually seen as being divinely inspired, Muslims believe that the Quran was not just inspired by God, it was literally dictated, word for word, in classical Arabic by Allah to Muhammad. As I mentioned earlier, Muhammad is said to be a descendant of Ismail. The genealogy is not actually given in the Quran, but there is a well-established tradition that traces his line back to a patrilineal ancestor named Adnan, who in turn was said to have been a descendant of Ismail. From early Islamic tradition, we also have quite a lot of details about the Prophet Muhammad's immediate family. For example, we know the name of his father, his mother, and many of his wives, the first of which was named Khadija. Only 4 of his biological children lived to adulthood, all 4 being daughters that he had with Khadija. However, of these 4 daughters, only one, Fatima, has descendants that are still living today, through her sons Hassan and Hussein. Fatima married Muhammad's first cousin, Ali. According to Shia Muslims, Ali was the legitimate successor of Muhammad, whereas according to Sunni Muslims, Muhammad was first succeeded by his father-in-law Abu Bakr, second by his father-in-law Umar, third by his son-in-law Uthman, and then fourth by Ali. Sunni Muslims consider these 4 men to have been the first 4 caliphs of Islam, and they refer to them as the Rashidun, meaning the rightly guided ones. After the death of Ali, the caliphate was first held by the Umayyad dynasty, the family of Uthman, and then by the Abbasid dynasty. You can see from the chart that these dynasties, note that the Umayyads used the white flag and the Abbasids used the black flag, were both closely related to the Prophet. However, neither were his descendants. For more information on the family tree of Muhammad, as well as of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphs, you can check out the 2 videos done on this topic by Useful Charts and Al-Muqaddimah. I'll leave a link to those in the description. Finally, remember how I mentioned earlier that I'd be doing a full episode on Moses next week? Well, that video will actually be part of a series that will also include videos by the channels Let's Talk Religion and Al-Muqaddimah. While I, as a Jew, will be talking about the historical evidence for Moses, Let's Talk Religion will be discussing the historical evidence for Jesus, and Al-Muqaddimah will be discussing the historical evidence for Muhammad. So if you're interested in learning more about the history surrounding Islam's final prophet, as well as both Musa and Isa, you'll want to keep an eye out for that. Once again, if you want a copy of this poster, you can head over to our website, usefulcharts.com. Thanks for watching.